This is an exceptional thing that we're debating right now. We're talking about limiting our own constitutional power. We're talking about a Trade Promotion Authority Act that would restrict our ability to offer and debate amendments on free trade agreements. We've been told that it's the only way that we can move forward on things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the soon-to-be completed European Free Trade Agreement. And there are great disagreements about whether that is necessary. It's hard to understand why we hold trade to a fundamentally different standard than so many other things that are vitally necessary for our economy to move forward. Why not have a different process to pass immigration reform or energy reform or tax reform? Those are just as, if not more, necessary to economic growth than trade. But in that we are talking about limiting our ability to offer amendments to a trade agreement, it would be the height of irony if we were to conduct that debate in a way that limited our ability to also offer amendments on the very act that takes away our power to amend the trade agreements. And so just a point on process. I'm fairly new to this body. This is the first time that I've been in the Senate debating a trade agreement, certainly the first time that I've been in the Congress to debate a fast-track bill, a trade promotion authority. I think we can take our time to allow this body to work its will, to make sure that we vote on more than a handful of amendments to a piece of legislation that takes away our power to offer amendments on the final trade bills. We took 3 weeks to debate the last fast-track bill. Now, I don't think anybody's asking for 3 weeks, but we're asking for more than a few days. Given that many of us think that we have amendments like the one that Senator Portman is offering that can make this bill a lot better. And so I'm coming to the floor today to ask for that time to get to a better place on this bill and to specifically ask for this body to take up a series of amendments surrounding one vital issue, and that's the issue of protecting the American supply chain on products bought by the United States government. It's commonly referred to as the Buy America law. It's been on the books for decades. Pretty simple premise that when we're buying things for the U.S. government, we should buy them from American companies, by and large. And it's a pretty meager requirement at the start. It just says that when you buy stuff for the American government, primarily for the Defense Department, you should buy 50% of it from U.S. companies. And that makes a lot of sense to people in the United States. In my state of Connecticut, we believe that that's just good economics, but it's also good national security policy. Because if you're not making things for the Department of Defense here, you're making them abroad, and you become reliant on a supply chain that's increasingly internationalized and puts you at risk when one of those countries that's supplying parts for a jet engine, for a tank, for a weapon, all of a sudden isn't your ally any longer. But the Buy American law has been riddled with loophole after loophole, exception after exception, such that the exceptions are now the rule. I won't go through the litany of ways that you can get around the Buy America law, so that sometimes today, items that are being bought by the Department of Defense are majority made outside of the United States, and frankly, often by countries that we may not be in total alignment with when it comes to our security policy. I want to talk about one waiver, one way around the Buy America law, and that's a really big one. There is a waiver to the Buy America law for any country that we have entered into a free trade agreement with. So if you have signed a free trade agreement with the United States, you can supply content to goods made for the United States military and have it count as made in America. Now, that's a pretty limited exception when you have only a small number of countries that you've signed free trade agreements with. But the two regions that we are talking about, adding to the ranks of those who have trade agreements with the United States, would represent the bulk of the global economy. You're talking about a swath of countries in Asia with very low wages, and then ultimately, with the European trade agreement, the whole of Europe. All of a sudden, you don't have a small exception to the Buy America rule. You have a truck-sized exception to the Buy America rule, rendering it almost obsolete and unenforceable at that point. Because then almost any country that is producing a good can apply for the trade agreement waiver. So we have a series of amendments that would try to tighten up this particular waiver, this particular option built into trade agreements. The amendment that I hope to offer simply says that if you want this waiver around the Buy America law, then you have to show that, one, the result of moving the work overseas won't cause a U.S. company to go under, and I can give you examples of when that's happened. And two, you have to prove that you can't find it in the United States, that your only option is to go overseas because you can't find it anywhere in the United States. If there's an American company making it for a reasonable price, then that company should be able to get that waiver. Now, it doesn't take away all the other waivers. There's a waiver, for instance, that says if you can get it for much cheaper overseas, then you can go overseas. We don't eliminate that waiver. We just say that you have to prove that you can't get it in the United States and you can't get it for a reasonable price in the United States. And then this waiver would apply. I think all of our constituents would support trade agreements that make sure that our taxpayer dollars that are being used to buy goods for the United States get used preferentially on American companies. And simply by tightening up this loophole in the Buy America law, we'll protect a lot of jobs. How do we know that? Well, because in 2013, the last year that we have records, there were 1,200 of these waivers approved. 1,200 waivers for existing countries with free trade agreements worth $500 million worth of goods. That's $500 million worth of work that would have gone to U.S. companies, that went to foreign companies because of this waiver that said that any country that has a free trade agreement just doesn't have to worry about the Buy America clause. That's 1,200 today. Imagine how many that will be a year if you were to add all of the countries in TTP and all of the countries in TTIP. You're talking about factors of 2 and 3 and 4 added to that number. And so all I'm asking for at this point is a debate. Let's just make sure that on this seminal issue, the preference that we give American companies for work paid for by federal taxpayers, that we have a discussion about that on the floor of the Senate at some point over the course of this week. Members can choose to vote up or down. They can choose to support American companies. They can choose to support the outsourcing of American taxpayer work. But let's have a discussion on it. We don't need 3 weeks like we did last time, but we probably need a couple more days. This is as big as you get for the United States Senate. We're debating giving away our power to amend a major trade obligation of the United States government. Let's have a debate about the consequences of that with respect to American companies. It'd make a difference to one set of people in my district, and I'll end on this. The former workers of Ansonia Copper and Brass. This is a company that made copper nickel tubing for our submarines. And they were the only American company that made this copper nickel tubing. And they had a competitor in Europe that was trying to take their business away. Because of a waiver to the Buy America law, the contract was awarded by the Department of Defense to the European firm, taken away from Ansonia Copper and Brass. Because of that waiver to the Buy America law, Ansonia Copper and Brass went out of business. We now have no ability in the United States to produce copper nickel tubing, some of the most important components to the American subfleet in the United States. Gone. Our capacity is ended. And you can't just rebuild this because this is a really specialized kind of material, a really specialized kind of product. Once that equipment, once that expertise is gone, you can't just start it back overnight. That has real security consequences for the United States. But I would argue even more importantly, it has serious economic consequences for the men and women who were laid off about a year ago from Ansonia Copper and Brass because of an ill-thought-out waiver to the Buy America clause that compromises our economic security and our national security. Let's just pledge to have a debate about that on the floor of the United States Senate before we come to a final vote on trade promotion authority. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.